If you're a maintenance supervisor for a commercial property, you've had to deal with everything from leaky faucets to flickering light bulbs. But nothing's worse than that ancient boiler that's lived in the building since the day it was built, 50 years ago. It's enough to make anyone lose their cool. That's where Grainger comes in. With industrial-grade products and dependable fast delivery, Grainger can help with any challenge, from worn-out components to everyday necessities. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hello, campers. Grab your marshmallows and gather around the True Crime Campfire. We're your camp counselors. I'm Katie.
And I'm Whitney.
And we're here to tell you a true story that is way stranger than fiction. We're roasting murderers and marshmallows around the True Crime Campfire.
Art is a mysterious thing. It's hard to pin down why one thing moves us and another does not. Similarly, it can be hard to identify that special spark, that unique creativity that an artist can have that lifts their work into something magical. If you don't have that, all the technical skill and carefully won knowledge in the world won't get you to that special place. Unless, of course, you just steal it from someone else. This is Fakin' It, art's greatest forger.
So, campers, for this one, we're on the beautiful Spanish island of Ibiza in the early months of 1967. Nowadays, Ibiza is most famous for its club scene, but in the 60s it was a quieter place, home to the locals and a colony of mostly bohemian foreigners, artists and hippies alongside a few millionaire retirees from Britain. Among the first category was a middle-aged Hungarian gentleman named Elmire Dori Boutin, and when we say gentleman, we mean he had blood as blue as a sapphire. At least that was what most people on the island assumed. The rumor was that Elmire was a scion of the Hungarian monarchy, which had been officially abolished in 1946 after Soviet occupation. Elmire, a dapper chap who wore cashmere sweaters and a monocle on a gold chain, neither confirmed nor denied those rumors, but he was less shy about his connections to the rich and famous. He liked to drop names so heavy they'd crush your toe if you didn't move fast enough. The stories were all the same shape. He'd be walking in some faraway city and be spotted by some old friend, Salvador Dali, maybe, or Tennessee Williams, or Zsa Zsa Gabor, and they'd go, "Elmire!" and rush joyfully into his arms. Elmire was a slightly shy but charming fellow who threw excellent parties and was popular in the expat community. Nobody ever saw him lift a finger work-wise. People assumed he came from old money and lots of it. He lived in a beautiful new clifftop villa with 7 bedrooms and a swimming pool, the kind of place Tony Stark might live in. Elmire told people he was an art collector, which is not a career so much as a hobby for the ridiculously rich. A couple of times, people spotted Elmire by the port doing watercolor sketches of the fishermen. Just another hobby, they assumed. A Russian artist happened to see an ink drawing on Elmire's desk once, an unsigned nude. "You did that?" the artist asked. Elmire nodded. "But that's not bad at all. Are you joking? Did somebody else?" "Yes, of course, someone else. I'm joking," Elmire said, and practically dragged the guy away from the desk. Elmire apparently had an extremely fine collection of French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art, hidden and then smuggled out of Hungary by his family, under the noses of the Germans first and then the Russians. A couple of Parisian art dealers sometimes sold these for him and occasionally visited him on Ibiza. These were Fernand Legros and Réal Lessard. Fernand was a twitchy, fast-talking dude in his mid-30s, the kind of guy you meet and immediately think might be kind of shady. And spoiler alert, you would not be wrong. Réal Lessard was 10 years younger, a relaxed, smiling French-Canadian that everybody liked and not too many people took seriously. When this story hit the news in the 60s, the papers, in the euphemisms of the time, described Réal as Fernand's traveling companion and personal secretary.
Oh my God, they were roommates.
They were hardly the only gay couple on Ibiza, and nobody cared much, the island being simultaneously really nosy about everybody's business and really accepting about whatever they found out. Fernand and Réal were highly successful at their trade and were much more willing than Elmire was to get flashy with their wealth. They gave him a gift of a bright red Corvette Stingray, which Elmire, in his monocle and cashmere sweaters, liked to tool around the little island in. But then rumors started to filter down from Paris. Fernand and Real were being investigated for selling forged works of art to businessmen in Texas. Then it wasn't just Texas. The Japanese National Museum of Western Art had been taken in too. All across the world, collectors and museums who had bought from Fernand Legros rushed to check the authenticity of their art, and they didn't like what they found. There were at least 50 fakes. No, 100. No, hundreds. On Ibiza, no one thought sweet, amiable Elmire could have anything to do with this, and if he had, he must have been tricked into it by that greasy Fernand Legros, who nobody on the island liked. Legros, it was rumored, must have an underground workshop of forgers somewhere to crank out so many paintings, maybe in the south of France, maybe right here on Ibiza.
But that wasn't true. There was just Elmire, who had painted and drawn hundreds, maybe thousands of forgeries good enough to fool experts all over the world for decades. And before we really get into Elmire's story, we should point out that a lot of this comes from what Elmire told Clifford Irving for the book Fake. As Irving himself acknowledges, Elmire didn't always walk hand in hand with the truth. I think you'll probably agree that Elmire wasn't really a classic con artist, but he was a guy who thought most stories could be improved by dialing them up a couple of notches. So his version of events is probably in the right ballpark, but won't necessarily have the correct score every time.
You never let facts get in the way of a good story, right?
Right. Elmire de Hory was born in 1906 to a wealthy family with estates and vineyards near Lake Balaton in central Hungary. Maybe. This is the part of Elmire's life story that's most likely to be fabricated, and later evidence suggests that his real origin story was very much middle class. But here's Elmire's possibly glammed up version. It was a luxurious life. They had horses, carriages, and servants, and ate off china plates with silver utensils. It was also, as was common among the rich, a fairly chilly and distant childhood. Elmire was mostly raised in the Kinderzimmer, a separate part of the house, by a whole series of governesses from France, Germany, and England. One of his earliest memories was waking up from a nightmare and going to find his mother, who was still up and entertaining guests. He ran to her and she picked him up, but when he tried to kiss her, she got angry and said, "You'll kiss my powder away." His father traveled overseas a lot, and Elmire didn't see him much.
Yikes.
Yeah. By the time he was 16, a couple of things were clear. Elmire had a real artistic talent, and he was gay. Gay sex was still illegal across Europe, but those laws were applied less strictly the more money or blue blood you had. A gay aristocrat would shock very few people, and a gay aristocratic artist even fewer. Art being a proper pursuit for a young gentleman, his mother sent Elmire to art school in Budapest, but he bugged his parents till they let him move at 18 to study in Munich. It's hard to imagine, given what would happen in just a few years, but pre-Nazi Germany was a swingin', free-spirited place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've seen Cabaret, right?
Oh, yeah.
Elmire went out drinking with his buds till the early hours almost every night, but he was also serious and diligent about his work, staying in school from 9 to 5 and sometimes working for weeks to perfect one of his drawings. Munich was fun, but there was only one place to study and work if you were really serious about being an artist, and when he was 20, Elmire moved to Paris. The same year, he had a landscape accepted to be shown at the famous Salon d'Automne, where the likes of Cézanne, Matisse, and Gauguin had been shown. This would be the greatest success Elmire's own work would ever have, but obviously he didn't know that at the time. He lived and worked in Paris for years, and though he would later exaggerate how well he knew them, he crossed paths with Matisse and Picasso, and met Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway.
He went to readings by James Joyce and had a reaction that lots of freshman English students would probably recognize. I hadn't the faintest idea what he was talking about, but I listened with great curiosity. I never liked James Joyce's stuff much, I have to admit, except for his letters to his wife, Nora, which are hilarious. Okay, if you've never seen these, Look him up sometime. You'll thank me later. I won't go into too much detail here, but let's just say Mr. Joyce and Nora both need to spend a little bit of time in the kink-shaming corner. Mm-hmm. Okay? The Nora letters, to my mind, are much more of a classic than Ulysses could ever be. Okay? Unlike the other young artists in Paris, Elmire got regular checks from his rich Hungarian family, and there was always more if he needed it. If he wanted to take a new boyfriend down to the beaches of Saint-Tropez, he just sent a telegraph home, and the funds would be waiting on the south coast when he got there. Dang, must be nice. This, as well as his fundamental personality, was why he never fully committed to art as a career. It was just an entertainment. If a friend liked a piece of his art, Elmire just said, take it. He was a familiar type in Europe in the 1920s, a spoiled, rich dilettante who found the idea of working for a living almost unthinkable. Ew. It was a lifestyle that would come crashing down in flames all across the continent in the next decade. By 1938, everyone in Paris was understandably nervous given what was happening over the border in Germany. Elmire headed back to Budapest, but while he'd been away, the country had drifted into far-right lunacy and was now essentially a client state of Nazi Germany. For Elmire, who was both gay and Jewish, this was obviously a perilous place to be, and it didn't help when he had an affair with an English journalist who turned out to be a spy. Elmire was sent to a camp for political prisoners in the Transylvanian mountains. Can you think of a creepier place to be on Earth? Mm-mm. It was a rough, freezing cold existence, but things can always get worse. Soon after his release, Elmire was arrested again, and this time they sent him to a concentration camp in Germany. There, he was beaten so badly by the Gestapo that they broke one of his legs, and he wound up in a hospital just outside Berlin. The famous Nazi efficiency was mostly a myth. There were no guards, and the doors and gates were left wide open at the hospital. So Elmire hobbled out into Berlin on his crutches. He had friends in the city from before the war who helped him hide and eventually get back to Budapest. The Nazis had killed his parents and stolen everything of value his family had owned. Now the Soviet Red Army was marching through Hungary, and obviously wealthy landowners would no longer be a thing under the inevitable communist regime. With some small diamonds sewn into the lining of his coat, all that remained of the family fortune, Elmire fled. The diamonds bought him passage across borders, and in 1945 he was back in newly liberated Paris, except this time he was poor. From riches to rags. He scratched out a living painting portraits for generous friends until April of 1946, when he accidentally began a brand new career as a forger. He was friends with Dolly Whittle, who was still known as Lady Malcolm Campbell after her famous ex-husband, who had held the world speed records on both land and water, and whom Dolly described as quite unfitted for the role of husband and family man. That's a nice way of putting it. Very genteel way of putting it. So I'm guessing he didn't only move fast when he was behind a steering wheel. Dolly was visiting Elmire's little studio and saw a drawing on his wall, an unsigned and unframed sketch of a girl's head. "That's a Picasso, isn't it?" she said. It wasn't. It was an Elmire de Hory, but he was curious why she'd thought it was Picasso. Dolly knew Elmire had known Picasso. Elmire had told her so, at least, and she knew Picasso didn't sign all his drawings. Before Elmire could come clean, Dolly offered to buy the drawing for £40. Elmire could live on that for 2 months. The drawing had taken him barely 10 minutes. After some wrestling with his conscience, he agreed, but he did feel guilty about tricking his friend. The guilt evaporated next time he saw Dolly, 3 months later, when she admitted that a gallery owner in London had offered her £150 for the drawing, which she thought was too much to turn down.
Elmire was out of money. He went home and pored through old art catalogs, and then, for an hour or so, practiced ink drawings in the style of Picasso around 1925. Around dinner time, a friend, a young American woman, dropped by for a drink. "Would you mind taking off your clothes and sitting in that wicker chair?" Elmire asked her politely, which is a sentence that would hit real differently from anyone except your gay artist friend. But Elmire was her gay artist friend, so she was like, sure. She stripped and sat, and Elmire drew her in the style of Picasso.
I'm just curious, I love that story, but why'd she need to be naked for that? I mean, I love Picasso, but it's hardly, photorealism. He's just going to turn your titties into a pair of isosceles triangles or some shit.
The next day, nervous and half convinced he was going to get arrested, Elmire took his nude sketch and 2 others he'd done of his friend's face and went to an art gallery on the left bank. He said he'd known Picasso before the war and the drawings had been a gift. Now, Elmire said, he was destitute and needed to sell them. This was a common story in the mess of Europe after World War II. The dealer looked at the drawings for 5 minutes while Elmire wandered around the gallery, then said, "Mais oui, c'est bon." He bought all 3 for the equivalent of $400 American, about $7,000 in today's money. Elmire told himself this was just a one-time deal, buying himself time to work on his own art. But nobody bought his own art, and by August he was broke again. Elmire was never discreet and told a friend, Jacques Chamberlain, about the fake Picasso. Chamberlain's father had a fine art collection in Bordeaux, which Nazi officers had stolen and shipped back to Berlin, where it had apparently been destroyed when Berlin was bombed. Chamberlain had a plan. They would travel around Europe, and he would sell Elmire's fakes to galleries, saying they were all that was left of his father's collection. Elmire toured galleries to study Picasso's work and found some pre-war paper stock to use. In 1 week, he drew 12 Picassos. He, Chamberlain, and Chamberlain's English girlfriend had a grand old time for a few months, touring Europe and staying in fancy hotels. Every one of Elmire's Picassos sold with no suspicion. But he had suspicions of his own when he saw one of the drawings on sale in a London gallery at an eye-watering price, and realized Chamberlain was keeping more than the 50-50 split they'd agreed upon.
That bastard. How dare he be so Oh, yeah. Shit.
No honor among thieves. They fought, and Elmire set sail alone for Scandinavia. There, accurately playing the role of a refugee Hungarian aristocrat, he sold some of his Picassos to a Swedish gallery for $6,000.
Wow.
Poor, paranoid Elmire, convinced the police would be on his tail any second, he was on a ship for Rio de Janeiro as soon as the check cleared. This is a theme for Elmire's life. He's always convinced.
Runs like a rabbit.
He always feels like somebody's immediately going to be on his tail. He figured this was the furthest he could run and still be in the civilized world. As would become normal for him whenever he made a big change in his life, he vowed he was done with forgery. From now on, he would go straight and make money with his own art.
Sure, Jan. Let me know how that works out. As he usually did wherever he traveled, Elmire quickly made friends with the hoity-toity crowd in Rio and made some money painting portraits for local notables, including a future president. But soon he got bored and decided to visit New York. He liked the States a lot. His visa was for 3 months, but he ended up staying for 11 years. Old friends from Paris introduced him around, and when he rented an apartment on East 78th Street, the guest list for his housewarming party included the likes of the Gabor sisters, Ava and Jaja, and actress Lana Turner. Wow. As was often the case, other people remembered events somewhat differently than Elmire. He said Jaja Gabor commissioned him to paint a nude portrait of her, and then, according to Elmire, she complained that one of the tits was too much in the center. I was paid for it, but very poorly. But Jaja said, I remember him well, but he never painted my portrait. In 1949, he came to visit me at the plaza and sold me 2 doofies. He said they were doofies for $5,000. They were fakes, and now I want my money back. I wish I could do a convincing Jaja impression, but I'd probably just completely biff it. Elmire was living high on the money from Sweden, but he wasn't earning anything, and the cash was dwindling fast. He parlayed his social success in New York to a one-man show at a 57th Street gallery. The show was packed with the wealthy and famous, and Elmire sold 1 portrait. He didn't even make enough to cover the cost of the catalog. There's a reason that starving artist is such a common phrase. Most people in the biz don't make much money at it, if any. If Elmire seriously wanted to pursue a career as a working artist, he'd have to seriously downscale, live in a tiny little loft without hot water, and develop a taste for baked beans. This was unacceptable. The only time in his life Elmire had ever been uncomfortable was when fascists had thrown him into prison camps. He was fundamentally a soft, spoiled aristocrat. He was also 42 years old and long past the time when poverty might seem kind of romantic and boho. So Elmire drew a couple more Picassos at his coffee table to test whether the American market was as easy to fool as the European one. And to absolutely no one's surprise, it was. And with some fresh cash in his pocket, he headed for California. Getting bored with Picasso, he added Renoir and Matisse to his repertoire and toured galleries up and down the West Coast, playing the mostly true role of the refugee aristocrat forced to sell the family art. He never asked for much, and that was a big part of why he was so successful. Getting so little for a piece wouldn't be worth a forger's time, people thought. Nobody could conceive of how quickly Elmire was able to turn these things out. This dude was an art-making machine. Like, he could shift into another frickin' time dimension. I don't know how he did it, and did it so well. And of course, it appealed to the dealer's greed. Here was this little European rube who had no idea of the real value of his art. The dealers thought they were fleecing him.
Con artists being conned. It's turtles all the way down.
After a while, Elmire headed to Texas. He said, I'd gone to some Western movies and I wanted to see the cowboys. And that is one of the gayest things I've ever heard. And I love it so much I want to marry it. I'd gone to some Western movies and I wanted to see the cowboys.
It's so very gay.
I love him so much.
Oh, Elmire.
We love you, Elmire.
We love you, Elmire.
He was probably being a little disingenuous, though. The wealth of the Texas oil boom was just starting to seep into the public consciousness, and new money meant a new market for fancy art. He liked how easygoing and generous people in Texas were, but he couldn't make any money with his honest art. The trouble in Dallas, he said, was that any portrait that didn't look like a county fair photograph they didn't like. Ooh, throwing shade. Back in Los Angeles and then New York, Elmire started working with oils rather than just in drawings. He was easily bored, and oils were much more of a challenge, and they sold for more too. In the 60s, another famous forger, David Stein, who got caught almost immediately, told the press that if he was painting Chagall, he became Chagall. If he was painting Matisse, he became Matisse. Elmire, and I, rolled his eyes at this. What he did was study and practice. If, say, he wanted to paint a Chagall, he'd just go to every gallery he could to see his work, get every art book and photograph he could find, and practice till he was able to duplicate the correct kinds of brushstrokes and the thickness and color of the paint, in addition to the artist's style. Almost all of his forgeries passed even expert appraisal at first glance. Just amazing.
Elmire wandered the Midwest for a while, selling to galleries. With his visa expired and having been unable to renew the fraudulent French passport he'd traveled on, he was essentially stateless, and he was paranoid that the FBI might be after him. He just like me for real. I literally always feel like I'm about to be caught anytime I do anything slightly wrong. Like immediately I'm
he
like...
He always thought they were coming for him, and they never were.
Never.
Like...
He was the perfect criminal. Like he was so good at what he did that everyone was just like, yeah, it looks like a Picasso, dope. And he was like, they're on to me.
He was smart about it too. I mean, he moved around a lot. Like he really, I think, was a very smart criminal.
This is the first criminal that we're like, he was a good guy.
I can't help it. I like Elmire.
He's the first guy we've ever been, because he also like genuinely like he was only conning people that would also be conning him, right? Like he would like he was going after people that were trying to con him. So who the gives a fuck?
Oh, yeah.
None of his experiences with government cops had ever been good, obviously, and the thought of being repatriated back to communist Hungary was terrifying. So he liked to keep moving. But as most of us would, he eventually got tired of it. In 1952, he moved back to Los Angeles and, once again, tried to make a living on his own art. He got a cheap apartment and worked for 6 months, and then tried to sell to local galleries. None of them bought anything. One gallery owner looked at Elmire, 45 years old, impeccably put together in his suit and tie and monocle, and sniffed, "You don't look like an artist."
Which had to suck, but my dude, if you want to look like an artiste, you really can't show up dressed like the Monopoly man. Okay? The little monocle, I love it so much. It's just not going to work. You look like the guy on the Pringles can. It's not going to work.
Despondent, Elmire tried to sell some of his simpler pieces, landscapes and seascapes, to furniture stores and interior decorators, and with this he had some success. This put him ahead of most working artists. He was making a modest, if unglamorous, living. He even traded 3 still lifes for an old Chevy. This was fine with Elmire. He always enjoyed his comforts, but he'd never been obsessed with acquiring stuff. But then he met a young ex-Marine called Jimmy Damien, and he was smitten. Jimmy soon moved in with him. Jimmy sounds like a pretty easygoing dude, and it's not like he tried to push Elmire into anything, but Elmire's relationships would soon follow a pattern. He'd get a handsome young boyfriend and want to spoil and impress him. When the rent on their new apartment was due, Elmire took out his old tools and in just a few minutes had a small Modigliani self-portrait. He sold it within the hour for $200. A month later, it sold to a Chicago collector for $4,000. Elmire was both furious and intrigued by the possibilities. For the first time in his life, he firmly committed to a career as a forger. He and Jimmy drove east, selling art to museums and dealers all along the way, and settled in a Miami Beach apartment. Elmire was committed to his new career, but he was sick of moving around. A life of working in the mornings and then going swimming with Jimmy in the afternoons was much more appealing, so he essentially set up a mail-order forgery business. Galleries and museums across the country would receive letters like this. Dear Sir, I'm in possession of a Matisse drawing, pen and ink, from period 1920 to 1925, representing a woman seated at a table with a bouquet of flowers, and for personal reasons I would like to dispose of it. If you would be interested, I will gladly send you a photograph. They were always interested. When they got in touch, Elmire would send a photograph of his forged piece, and they'd agree on a price pending examination of the piece. Because he'd heard you could get in big trouble by using U.S. mail in any criminal activity, Elmire always sent the art by Railway Express Delivery Company.
It wasn't quick. Museums would sometimes keep a piece for weeks to have it assessed, but ultimately Elmire had a near 100% sales record. Everything he offered, somebody bought. He sold around 70 drawings and paintings and made around $160,000, nearly $2 million in today's money. But soon it all came crashing down. A Chicago gallery owner named Joseph Faulkner had bought a couple of Matisse drawings from Elmire. After experts from the Art Institute assured him they were genuine, he bought more. Renoirs, Modiglianis, more Matisses. Again, the Art Institute said they were the real deal. But when he sent several drawings to New York for an exhibition, they were spotted as fake. Faulkner called Elmire and asked for certificates of authenticity. Elmire vaguely said, Sure, I'll look for 'em, but not right now. I have a friend visiting from Europe. He hung up the phone and got the hell out of Florida immediately. Faulkner reimbursed his clients who had bought the paintings, and then he called the feds. FBI agents visited the Miami Beach apartment where Jimmy played dumb, but by that time Elmire was already on his way to Mexico City. As always, Elmire was a hit with the hoity and the toity, and even had a gallery show there, but he couldn't make any money. There were plenty of wealthy collectors in Mexico City, but they flew to New York or Paris to buy anything. Elmire was already thinking of leaving when events made up his mind for certain. The Mexico City police hauled him in for questioning. Elmire despaired, certain that the long arm of the FBI had reached south of the border. But no, the police wanted to question him about a murder. Turns out a wealthy gay Englishman had retired to a palatial villa in one of the Mexico City suburbs. He'd been found dead in his bed, strangled. He'd been known to cruise the city's gay bars, and the police already had a suspect in custody, a young man named Carlos. Elmire had no idea what this had to do with him. He'd never even met this Englishman. And the boy, Carlos, the police asked. I never met him either, Elmire said. But the police had found a little notebook of Carlo's with the names and phone numbers of several older gay men, including both the murdered man and Elmire. He remembered then. He'd met Carlos at a cocktail party once, flirted with him a little, and gave him his phone number. When Elmire explained this to the police, they believed him, but they also said they'd gone to a lot of trouble chasing down this lead. Maybe 1,000 pesos worth of trouble if Elmire was interested in going home quickly. He argued them down to 500, and they drove him home and wished him a pleasant good night. They picked him up again a week later for another 500 pesos. Being gay and apparently wealthy meant the cops could keep milking him forever against the threat of jail time. After the third time, Elmire went to a lawyer. When the lawyer called to say everything was taken care of, Elmire then got a bill for $1,000. He was furious. He could have paid off the cops 20 more times for that. Elmire paid the lawyer off with a fake Renoir and headed back to the U.S. Looking over his shoulder for the FBI was better than this. Just imagine that, y'all. You get extorted by the cops, so you hire a lawyer to, go to bat for you, and then the lawyer extorts you too. Womp womp. That would not be fun. Elmire's forged works were beginning to have lives of their own. One of his Matisse paintings sold for more than $60,000. Back in New York, Elmire visited Brentano's bookstore and looked through a recent book on Modigliani drawings. 3 of his fakes were in there, one of them described as a masterpiece. It seemed like every art book published after 1957 contained some of his work. Elmire had a second fancy New York housewarming, and a doctor friend had the nerve to bring along an unsuitable companion.
Elmire said he hadn't shaved in at least 2 or 3 days. He had a long, narrow nose, thin black hair, a suit and shirt that wasn't just soigné, but looked like he'd slept in it for 3 days in Washington Square. He looked like a Bowery bum, and I gave him my usual stare that I reserve for such types.
Bitchy, gosh.
We love Elmire. I just can't help it. I'm sorry. This was Fernand Legros, half Greek, half French, former cabaret dancer who had just run away to the States after an unhappy love affair. Elmire disliked him on sight. Elmire had a run of bad luck that left him nearly broke and in fear of the FBI once more. He made a semi-serious attempt to end his own life with sleeping pills. His doctor friend helped him recover, then suggested that Fernand Legros drive Elmire back to Miami Beach and looked after him there. Elmire's boyfriend Jimmy was long gone. He'd hit the road while Elmire was in Mexico. That horror, Elmire said, but let himself be talked into it. There was never anything romantic or physical between Elmire and Fernand, but they became an odd pair of roommates. Actual roommates this time.
Yeah.
Elmire found Fernand almost acceptable once he had a bath and a haircut, and at least he was intelligent company, if a little bitchy and unpredictable. In a few weeks, Elmire was stronger, but almost out of money. "How are we going to live now?" Fernand complained. "We," Elmire said, "go out and get a job." But Fernand wasn't into that. The only job he'd ever had was an airline ticket agent for a few weeks in New York. "It didn't suit me," he told Elmire. "I think maybe they didn't like each other because they had too much in common."
I know, right?
He knew about Elmire's past. "Why don't you just do one little drawing?" he said. "It won't take you more than a day, and we could live for a month on what you get for it." "It would only take me half an hour," Elmire pointed out. But he was wary. Museums and galleries across America had come to be cautious about buying anything from a rich Hungarian. Elmire had sold under quite a few aliases, but he was distinctive, memorable. The Monopoly Man. But Fernand had a solution. He would do the selling. All Elmire had to do was draw and paint. This was appealing. Elmire had always hated selling his art. Fernand was shrewd and forceful. He'd be way better at it. He agreed. Not long after, Elmire was strolling along the beach and got to chatting with a good-looking Canadian 19-year-old called Rial Lassard, who had been lying in the sand. Young Rial was kind of an uncarved block. Not dumb at all, just kind of simple. He'd grown up in a tiny Quebecois village just across the border from Vermont, and he'd hitchhiked down to Florida because he wanted to sit in the sun. And that was what he'd spent his days doing, just sitting in the sun. Elmire invited him to dinner, but irritatingly, Fernand made the bigger impression, and soon he and Rial were sharing a hotel room.
What the hell, Fernand? You're sponging off Elmire's art sales. Now you're going to mac on his new boy toy? That has got to be against the roommate code. Jeez.
Elmire and Fernand went to Chicago, where Fernand, with careful instructions from Elmire on what to say, sold 2 Matisses, a Picasso, and a Braque. The new partnership was off to a flying start, but when they got back to Miami Beach, Rial told them an FBI agent had been looking for Elmire. Damn it. Time to hit the road.
Elmire had thought he'd left this life behind, traveling from city to city, selling his art, but here he was again. At least all he had to do was paint this time. To give him privacy to work, wherever they were, Elmire stayed in one hotel and Fernand and Rial in another. The deal was that Elmire would get 60% of whatever they made and Fernand 40%, but Elmire only had Fernand's word on how much they made, and soon he noticed that the other two were staying in nicer places than he could afford. But he was scared of arrest. He needed Fernand, so he didn't make waves. In California, Fernand fell ill with hepatitis and was bedridden for a month. Rial, who'd been the pair's chauffeur and general helper, was by his bed day and night. When he started to feel better, Rial went out for a walk, then decided to see a movie. He didn't get back till 10 p.m., by which time Fernand had worked himself up into a jealous rage that was one hell of a thing to behold. I mean, this man kirked the hell out. He threw plates, he smashed windows, he screamed and yelled, he tore the sheets, he fell on the floor and thrashed around like he needed a damn exorcist or something. Drama! Elmire had been with him and Rial for 6 months, and at this point he decided he'd had enough, not only of them, but of living nervously in the U.S. He wanted to go to Europe. Fernand and Rial did too. They assumed they'd continue the business, but Elmire planned on ditching him as soon as possible. For $2,000, they got a Canadian passport for Elmire in the name of Joseph Boutin. Boutin was a real person, an unassuming Ontario insurance clerk with a wife and kids. Fernand was certain the guy would hardly ever leave his hometown, never mind want to travel abroad. Elmire left the United States as the most prolific and successful forger in history. He didn't keep records and had no idea how many pieces he'd actually made. Hundreds, for sure. Even when experts in the U.S. had started to catch on to him, they had no idea of how prolific he had been. One gallery owner said, "Dehory had some talent, but the outstanding forger of our time was Reynal. He was a magnificent forger, a true genius." This is hilarious because Reynal was one of Elmire Dehory's aliases. I love it. After 13 years, Elmire was back in Paris. It hadn't changed much. He felt like he'd come home. His pleasant reunion with the city was upset, though, when Fernand and Rial showed up, staying in the same hotel as him, with Fernand pressing him to get back to work. But Elmire, once again, was determined to try and make a living on his own art. Once again, that lasted until his bank account had dwindled almost to zero. He'd moved to Rome and started forging again, then drove around Europe to sell his pieces, but whatever money he made, he couldn't hold on to. He'd always been awful with money. Despondent, he searched for somewhere quiet and out of the way where he could live cheaply and work. He settled on Ibiza. Soon after settling in there, he went to Paris to try and sell a couple of his Matisse drawings and ran into Fernand and Rial almost immediately. Fernand, he thought, looked much better put together than usual. In fact, he looked wealthy. What Elmire didn't know was that Fernand had sold some of Elmire's pieces, including a valuable fake Cézanne that Elmire thought was hidden in New York. With the money from that, and with the connections he'd made, Fernand was now a reasonably successful and mostly legitimate art dealer. When Elmire showed him and Rial a portfolio of his own watercolors from Ibiza, Fernand exclaimed over them and bought them all for $50 each. Elmire was flattered and impressed with the ease with which Fernand threw money around. He'd probably have been less impressed if he knew Fernand owed him thousands of dollars for his cut of the Cézanne, but Elmire wouldn't find out about that for years.
The truth was, Fernand was essentially a con man, and Elmire was essentially a mark. What did I say? Con men all the way down. Fernand knew a combination of flattery and forceful persuasion could convince Elmire to do what he wanted. When Fernand found out that Elmire had been selling his own fakes, he visited his hotel room and scolded him for taking such risks. "You are a master now," he said. "You shouldn't expose yourself that way. Rial and I are getting to be known in the art world. We'll take all the risks, and you can live quietly on this little island you talk about. You'll have security. We'll send you a few $100s every month." He wanted Elmire to get started right away. He'd send him $400 a month, which was more than enough to be comfortable in Ibiza. Every time Fernand made a big sale, Elmire would get a bonus. Fernand gave him a list of what he needed. First, some doofy and some derain. Elmire was wary about getting in trouble in Spain, upsetting his idyllic island life. He lived in Ibiza and painted his own work there. But for his fakes, he always flew to Morocco or Portugal to work intensely for weeks at a time. The watercolors Elmire could roll up and mail, but for oils, Rial flew down to collect them. By now, he was a full partner with Fernand and knew at least as much as his partner did about the art business. When Elmire asked him how he and Fernand were getting on, Rial would just shrug glumly and say, "The same," meaning Fernand was still insanely jealous and sometimes violent. Rial acted as a liaison between Fernand and Elmire and often bought Elmire art books to help his work. He also helped in small ways with the painting itself, applying a special restorer's varnish which dried the surface of oils and produced the cracks that truly old paintings have. Elmire was completely separated from the selling side of the operation. Fernand sold the first doofies for $8,000 each. Elmire got a $1,200 bonus, and Fernand moved into a fancy new apartment. He was able to charge more for works that had an attached expertise, a certificate of authenticity for works by dead artists provided by experts recognized by the French government. In return for this service, the experts received a nominal fee. Fernand, in his direct way, saw that the nominal fee part was where the weakness lay. "I wasn't trying to bribe anyone," he said later. "I just dropped $1,000 on the table. If the man didn't pick it up, I dropped a second $1,000. I found that people preferred round numbers." One expert certified Elmire's doofy so often that when two genuine works came to him, he refused to certify them because to him, Elmire's paintings were the standard.
Oh my God, that is hysterical.
Not all the old painters were dead. Kees van Dongen was 90 years old and living with his wife near Monte Carlo. Rial went to visit him with one of Elmire's fakes, hoping to get the old artist to certify that it was his. Although it was based on van Dongen's 1908 Woman with Hat, it was an original piece. Van Dongen, who had been quite the ladies' man in his day, stared at the painting, smiled, and told Rial that of course he had painted it. Then he gleefully told him how many times he'd had to stop painting to make love to his model. His signature on the certification was shaky, but genuine.
Oh, you dirty old turtle. Elmire's works were soon selling for tens of thousands of dollars. Fernand was well on his way to becoming a millionaire. His new apartment had crystal chandeliers and gold leaf ceilings, red velvet wallpaper, and gold faucets in the bathrooms. And despite his poisonous jealousy over Rial, it also had what was more or less a harem of half-naked young men who were always lounging around the place. On one trip to Japan, Fernand and Rial made $250,000, which would be worth 10 times that today. Elmire's bonus from all this was a 6-inch portable Japanese TV set. It was all quite deliberate. Rial said later, "We had to keep him poor or he would quit." Oh, I hate this guy. Elmire didn't share their interest in being rich. He just wanted an easy life. Fernand had become a pretty cool customer, except when it came to Rial. If Fernand ever saw his boyfriend so much as glance at a pretty boy or girl, he'd either flounce off or throw his drink in Rial's face, even if they were right in the middle of talking to a prospective client. If Fernand had to be out of town alone, he'd hire a private detective to follow Rial around while he was gone. But you've got a condo full of half-naked dudes. Hypocrite, much? One time, when he hadn't liked the detective's report, Fernand flung Rial's clothes out the window. Rial bought a brand new Alfa Romeo convertible, which he loved. One time, he and Fernand were driving down the Champs-Élysées, arguing when Fernand ground out a cigarette on the passenger side carpet. "Stop that!" Rial yelled. Fernand started deliberately burning holes in the shiny new red leather interior with his lighter while Real yelled at him. So Real pulled up beside a cop and said, "Officer, this man sitting next to me has not only made me an improper proposition, but he was trying to molest me sexually in my own car." They were both taken into the police station and released a few hours later once they'd cooled down, and Real decided not to press charges. Toxic. Elmire couldn't understand why they were still together, but then he had no idea how much money the two of them were making. Still, it was clear that Fernand and Real's dramatic relationship was in stormy waters, even by their standards. Whenever either of them was alone with Elmire, they complained about the other, and Fernand and Real had always complained about Elmire, too. Each of the three had a secret, bitchy little nickname that the other two used behind their back. The always dramatic Fernand was Cleopatra, Real was the peasant, and poor old Elmire was grandma. Oof. That's the worst one. When they next visited Grandma on Ibiza, he was in a bad mood. The hotel across from his apartment was adding a second floor, which was going to block his view of the sea. Fernand's solution was simple. They would buy some land and build a house, a beautiful house. They wanted Elmire to be comfortable, after all. "Buy it with what?" said Elmire, who still had no clue how much his work was selling for. Fernand said he would build it, and own it, of course. Elmire was living under a false identity. It wasn't wise for him to be on any official documentation. The house, La Falaise, got bigger and grander through every stage of the design. When it was finished, it was the most luxurious property on the island. Its construction finally made Elmire suspicious about how much money Fernand was making, but he didn't follow this thinking through to the next logical step, that Fernand was ultimately building this palace for himself, not Elmire. Cleopatra and the peasant, meanwhile, were on the outs, with their fights, Fernand's side anyway, getting ever more dramatique. Then Real met a pretty French girl and fell in love. In January of 1966, they got engaged. Fernand had a predictable meltdown. He hired some Marseille mafia types to rough up Real, but dialing up the antagonism with Real was not such a smart move.
Like we said when we introduced him, Real was not at all dumb, and he wasn't a sun-worshipping teenager anymore. He'd been at Fernand's side through every step of their art business, and he'd handled the money. Fernand was too chaotic and too bored by it. He'd made the deals with clients, but it was Real who'd taken the checks and handled all the bank transfers. And while Fernand was burning through his income with gold faucets and private detectives, Real had been investing his share in Canadian real estate. What's more, over the years, he'd collected $92,000 of IOUs from Fernand. Now, he said Fernand had to either give him the cash or sell him that ostentatious apartment. "Never!" Fernand shrieked. So Real took his IOUs to the authorities and asked for a writ of seizure on the property.
Ooh, girl.
But they were still in business together, and a couple days later, before a trip to New York, they had a fancy dinner at the apartment. The French legal system moved quicker than Real had expected. Midway through the meal, Fernand's butler let in a process server who announced he was seizing the apartment in Real's name. Real fled as Fernand screamed and threw, in this order, a salmon, some silver cutlery, and a lit candelabra at him. The red velvet laws briefly caught on fire.
Oh my God. What is this, a telenovela? Is somebody's evil twin going to step out from behind the curtains?
I want to know if the salmon was raw, cooked, sauced. Details, people, details. They fought over Elmire, each pressuring him to paint their own preferred works. And they weren't the only cause of stress for Elmire. Remember, his passport, his whole legal identity, was taken from a Canadian insurance clerk named Joseph Bouton, chosen specifically because his life was so boring. The passport was expiring, so Real in Rotterdam took it to the Canadian consulate to try and get it renewed. As he waited, the clerk checked his files and started frowning. It turned out that boring Joseph Bouton had been hunted by the Mounties for years on charges of possession of stolen goods and bigamy.
Oh my God.
"Where is this man?" the clerk demanded. Real just turned and ran. Once again, Elmire had no passport and no official identity. Elmire didn't do well under pressure. his work suffered badly. One time, Fernand had to remind him with gritted teeth to add the E onto Matisse's signature.
Oh, man.
The work might have been poorer, but Fernand kept selling it anyway, including 56 works to Texas oil tycoon Alger Hurdle Meadows. 38 of them were forgeries, and when they were revealed as such, Meadows found unwanted fame as the man with the world's largest and best collection of fake paintings. A lot of victims of fraud don't come forward out of embarrassment at being taken for dupes, but Meadows was beyond that. He was furious, and he wanted blood, demanding that authorities in both France and the US take actions against Fernand. He caused such a stir that everyone who had ever bought from Fernand took a closer look at what they had bought. Some of the works were genuine. Fernand did deal in genuine art as well as fakes, but almost all of them were from the brush and pen of Elmire de Hory. Fernand was in a panic. He burned all his records and packed 9 suitcases full of clothes and jewelry, then headed south with his new American boyfriend acting as a chauffeur. From Barcelona, they took a boat to Ibiza. Elmire was away at a theater opening in Madrid, so they just broke into La Falaise through the kitchen door. The next day, they changed the locks.
Fernand insisted he was innocent. It's a plot on the part of jealous American art dealers, he declared. The next day, he might say, it's a conspiracy on the part of those jealous art dealers in Paris. He told everyone he could that Elmire was a madman, wanted for murder in Mexico. Elmire tried to force Fernand out, but it was Fernand's house. Elmire left his island sanctuary and was once again a refugee, wandering the capitals of Europe and staying with friends. Fernand, meanwhile, was making himself thoroughly unpopular with his neighbors with raucous parties. Then, while he was in London on business, Fernand learned that the charges instigated by Alger Hurdle Meadows were about to drop. He fled to Cairo, where he'd been born, hoping to avoid extradition back to France. And that might have worked, but in February of 1968, a young man was arrested in Switzerland for trying to pass $12,000 of bad checks. Réal Lessard had been unable to get his hands on his saved money. I guess once he became wanted, the French authorities froze his accounts. Fernand Legros was certainly an odd duck. He might have tried to brain Réal with a smoked salmon, but Réal was still the person, other than himself, that he cared most about in the world. So in April, a man in hippie-like clothes with long blonde hair and dark glasses showed up in Geneva. His British passport identified him as Fernand MacDonald. He spent all day on the phone trying to arrange Réal's release. He was sufficiently suspicious that the hotel tipped off the police. When they tried to detain him in the hotel bar, he ran for it, and in the resulting scuffle, his blonde wig and dark glasses fell off, and police had Fernand Legros in their clutches. Cleopatra and the peasant were headed for the slammer. A friend had gotten in touch with Elmire once Fernand had fled, and he came back to Ibiza. La Falaise looked like a wild month-long party had just wound up. Windows were smashed, clothes were everywhere, cigarette holes were burned into the upholstery. Elmire and his maid cleaned everything up. Within a few weeks, he had picked up his old peaceful life, but he fully expected the boot of justice to fall on him soon, although possibly not too hard. A Spanish lawyer told him that if he hadn't personally sold any fake paintings in Spain, hadn't painted them in Spain, and hadn't copied any Spanish masters, then he hadn't actually broken Spanish laws, and it was highly unlikely he'd be extradited to the US or France, which actually does make sense if you think about it. Ultimately, Elmire was arrested, not for his forgeries, but under laws against vagrants and social undesirables. He was charged on the basis of his homosexuality and for consorting with known criminals, Fernand Legros. Jeez Louise. He was given 2 months in the relatively pleasant Ibiza jail. This was still prison, but he was allowed to bring his own bed, books, clothes, and stereo, as well as his sleeping pills and anxiety meds. The cells opened onto a shared patio. Most of Elmire's fellow inmates were young, long-haired British hippies arrested on charges ranging from public nudity to weed possession. Elmire hired one of them as his valet. He cleaned Elmire's cell, washed his dishes, and set up his deck chair on the patio. God. Oh my God, so funny. Elmire had been distraught at his conviction, but his 2 months actually passed quite pleasantly. In Switzerland, Fernand Legros got a 3-month suspended sentence for entering the country on a forged passport, but they resisted extraditing him to France. The rumors among gossipy Parisian art dealers, not necessarily the most reliable of sources, were that 2 French cabinet ministers had enjoyed a particular type of party with Fernand and his harem of half-naked young men and didn't really try too hard to bring him home. Oh my. After his release, and as this story broke internationally, Elmire became something of a minor celebrity. He signed a deal for the Clifford Irving book and a couple years later for an Orson Welles documentary. He tried to parlay this attention into success for his own work, but people still weren't interested. The fakes were what counted.
Joseph Faulkner, the Chicago art dealer, offered to refund one of Elmire's Modiglianis to the Minneapolis collector who'd bought it. "Are you serious?" the collector said. He wanted Faulkner to come up and write on the back of the drawing, "I, Joseph Faulkner, certify that this is an original and genuine Modigliani fake by Elmire de Hory."
I love it.
Elmire's peaceful time on Ibiza would not be eternal. In 1976, he learned that Spain had agreed to extradite him to face charges in France. He deliberately overdosed on sleeping pills and died before he could be taken to the hospital.
Oh man, I hate that that's how that ends. I just hate it.
As for Fernand Legros, if he'd stayed in Switzerland, maybe he would have been okay, but in 1973, he was arrested in Rio de Janeiro and eventually extradited to France. He was convicted of fraud and fined $3,000 and sentenced to 2 years in prison, most of which was suspended on psychiatric advice. He died of throat cancer in rural France in 1983. After serving a short prison sentence, Réal Lessard kept out of the spotlight and studied to become an artist, with some modest success. I think he's still alive today, in his 80s, and apparently keeping a low profile.
I doubt he would have ever admitted it, but I think Elmire de Hory probably felt at least some degree of shame about what he did. You don't get to be so good at his job without a deep love of art and a respect for what the people he copied had achieved. Whenever he got the chance, he always turned back to his own art, trying to get people to notice it and value it. They never did. It certainly was not for a lack of technical skill. Elmire could match any painter on the planet brushstroke for brushstroke, often quite literally. But that special magic great artists have, what they see, what they want to show, what they want to say, Elmire just didn't have it, although he could recognize it in the works of others. I can hardly imagine how frustrating that must be, to know you have every tool needed to make that magic, but be incapable of doing it. I think that frustration is what led to his strange wandering life. Maybe he'd be happy to know that his pieces, retitled as homages, are still selling. There are even people out there trying to sell fake de Horys. So that was a wild one, right, campers? We'll have another one for you next week. But for now, lock your doors, light your lights, and stay safe until we get together again around the True Crime Campfire. And as always, we want to send a grateful shout out to a few of our lovely patrons. Thank you so much to Suzanne, Chris, Crystal, Gail, Dathan, and Zaya No Name. What a cool username. We appreciate y'all to the moon and back. And if you're not yet a patron, you're missing out. Patrons of our show get every episode ad-free at least a day early, sometimes even 2, plus tons of extra content, like patrons-only episodes and hilarious post-show discussions. And once you hit the $5 and up categories, you get even more cool stuff. A free sticker at $5, a rad enamel pin or fridge magnet while supplies last at $10, virtual events with Katie and me, and we're always looking for new stuff to do for you. So if you can, come join us at patreon.com/truecrimecampfire. And if you haven't booked your spot on the Crime Wave True Crime Cruise from November 3rd through November 7th, get on it, y'all. Join Katie and me, plus Last Podcast on the Left, Scared to Death, and Sinisterhood for a rockin' good time at sea. You've got to have a fan code to book a ticket, so go to crimewaveatsea.com/campfire and take it from there.